What could be more terrifying than finding oneself a pawn in the hands of ruthless power? Only to become one in the hands of your own father, the Pope, who decided to turn your wedding into the most shameful ritual in the history of the Vatican. On the night when the sacred halls of the Apostolic Palace were meant to celebrate a pious union, they were transformed into a theater of monstrous humiliation, one that chroniclers would write about with a shudder for centuries. This is the story of Lucrezia Borgia, a woman trapped in a dynasty where power meant more than blood, faith, or human dignity. A woman whose wedding night became one of the darkest stains in the history of the Catholic Church, an indelible mark on the reputation of the Holy See. In the autumn of 1501, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica carried news across Rome that instantly consumed all of Italy, silencing the markets and bringing diplomatic chancelleries to a standstill. Pope Alexander VI, a man whose name had already become synonymous with intrigue and nepotism, announced that his daughter, twice widowed under circumstances steeped in the thick poison of suspicion, was to marry again. But this time, there would be no remote palace, no quiet noble hall for a modest ceremony hidden from prying eyes. The celebration was to take place in the very heart of the Christian world, in the Vatican, in the personal papal apartments, beneath the sacred frescoes and symbols meant to embody heavenly judgment. The groom chosen for Lucrezia was Alfonso d'Este, the young heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara, one of the oldest and most respected families in Italy. To the rest of Europe, this union looked like a political triumph for the Borgias, but for Alfonso himself, it felt like a quiet execution, a sentence that had already been signed and could not be appealed. Lucrezia's past was infamous in all the royal courts, from Madrid to Vienna, and was retold in whispers in every tavern. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, ruler of Pesaro, had fled Rome to save his life, publicly declaring that hired blades had been sent after him on the orders of his father-in-law, the Pope himself. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biscaya, whom she was rumored to have genuinely and deeply loved, was ruthlessly eliminated right on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, and then finished off in his bed. And all the arrows, all the evidence, and all the silent glances of the courtiers pointed directly to her brother, the formidable Cesare Borgia, the cardinal who became a commander. And now another Alfonso was being forcibly bound to the Borgia family, to a dynasty whose name had become synonymous with betrayal, poison, and cruelty masked as a papal blessing. He knew the danger. Every nobleman in Italy knew that a marriage to Lucrezia was an invitation for death into one's home. Desperately trying to avoid what he felt was inevitably approaching, Alfonso tried every possible ruse. He cited diplomatic pretexts, stalled negotiations, and pleaded through ambassadors, hoping the Pope would find another, more compliant victim. But Alexander VI was not a man who tolerated refusals or accepted the word no. Inside the Vatican, surrounded by cardinals clad in scarlet, his command was absolute. His will was law. Day and night, couriers galloped along frozen roads to Ferrara with a simple and brutal message: accept this marriage, or you will be destroyed. If the d'Este family dared to resist, Ferrara would face the merciless armies of Cesare, which had already conquered the cities of Romagna with fire and sword. Their ancient dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, could be wiped from the face of the earth, and excommunication would strip them of both their legitimacy and all their allies. Italy understood this truth all too well. No one survived an open conflict with the Borgias. Realizing that resistance meant the complete destruction of his house and subjects, the old Duke Ercole d'Este ordered his son to go to Rome and submit to the inevitable. Alfonso had to surrender to save his lineage. He rode to his own wedding as if to the scaffold, feeling the gazes of all of Italy upon him, full of pity and contempt. Meanwhile, in her luxurious Vatican apartments, Lucrezia Borgia gazed out at the eternal city, her face shadowed by a sorrow far older than her 21 years. Europe painted her as a seductress, a poisoner, a woman who manipulated men like chess pieces. But those close to her knew the truth hidden behind the golden cage. She was not a genius of deceit, but the most valuable pawn, caught between the boundless ambitions of her father and the icy cruelty of her brother. Her first marriage was annulled the moment it ceased to be of political use to them, with a public humiliation that branded her name. Her second husband, whom she had truly loved, was eliminated almost before her eyes, and it was a fate she could neither prevent nor avenge. The servants whispered that she often awoke in the middle of the night, clutching her chest and trembling from nightmares she refused to discuss, even with her most trusted ladies-in-waiting. She knew this third marriage would not bring her love, but even she, accustomed to the intrigues of her court, could not imagine what her father and brother would turn her wedding night into. Something dark, calculated, and unspeakably cruel was already gathering behind the walls of the Vatican. Preparations for the ceremony proceeded with feverish haste, but the atmosphere in the apostolic palace felt as suffocating as the air before a thunderstorm. Servants moved silently, lowering their eyes when they met members of the papal family, and cardinals whispered in hushed tones in shadowed alcoves. Strange, cloaked figures passed through forbidden corridors at unseemly hours, and rumors multiplied about secret instructions, about guests being led in through hidden passages. And one man felt the weight of it all more than anyone else. Johann Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies, a German who meticulously recorded every step of the papal court. He had seen countless scandals under Alexander VI, extravagant feasts, political bribes, the sale of sacred offices like trinkets at a market. But something about this night stirred a cold, clammy unease in him, a premonition of disaster. He sensed that this event would overshadow all the scandals he had ever recorded in his secret diary. He felt he was about to witness something that history would struggle to speak of aloud, something that would defile the very stone from which these walls were built. The trap was set, gilded, polished, and inescapable, and both the bride and the groom were already walking straight into its center, guided by the will of one man. In December 1501, Alfonso d'Este entered Rome with a small, almost funereal escort. His journey from Ferrara had taken him through the frozen passes of the Apennines, over broken roads, and through a growing dread that settled heavily in his chest with every hoofbeat. But nothing, no stories or warnings, had prepared him for the sight of the Vatican, a stone colossus looming over the city, half drenched in torchlight, half lost in scaffolding. It looked less like the heart of Christendom and more like a tyrant's fortress, built to consume those who dared to oppose it. Inside, the reception was stunning in its overwhelming luxury. Alexander VI sat enthroned in shimmering white and gold robes that reflected the light of hundreds of candles like molten metal. Beside him stood Cesare, silent, motionless, and frightening in his restrained power. Though only 26, he was already feared throughout Italy, and his motto, "Aut Caesar, aut nihil," either Caesar or nothing, was carved on the blades of his soldiers. When his cold gaze met Alfonso's, the meaning was unmistakable. "You are not a guest here. You are a trophy." In the weeks that followed, Alfonso endured a series of humiliations, carefully disguised as festivities and honors. At banquets, he was deliberately seated next to Rome's most famous courtesans, while high-ranking clergy watched with poorly concealed amusement. On hunts, Cesare demonstrated a ruthless skill that felt more like a warning than a sport, striking any target with ease. During receptions, Alexander VI would make sharp, loud remarks about the tragic fates of Lucrezia's previous husbands, as if savoring his future son-in-law's discomfort. Every gesture, every word carried the same quiet, chilling threat. "You belong to us now." And the worst part, the true horror of this wedding, the moment that history would whisper about for centuries, had not even begun. Hunts were organized in the Roman Campagna, where Cesare, dressed in black, demonstrated his superiority with a cold, effortless precision, reminding Alfonso with every loosed arrow and every fallen beast that he commanded not only armies, but fear itself. There were receptions where Alexander mocked the fates of Lucrezia's previous husbands before the entire court, almost cheerfully hinting at how short and miserable the life of a Borgia son-in-law usually was. Alfonso desperately tried to preserve the remnants of his princely dignity, but by then he was already a prisoner, wrapped in a ceremonial shell of silk and gold. His own nights were spent in virtual isolation in the Vatican under contrived pretexts of security. He slept in rooms guarded day and night by papal guards, who seemed more like jailers than an honor guard. Each passing hour revealed the cruel truth more clearly. He had walked into a trap, and there was no way back. This marriage was nothing but a facade, a political theater for all of Europe. The true purpose was far more vicious and personal. The Borgias intended not just to forge an alliance, but to break the pride of the ancient d'Este family, to humiliate them before all of Italy, and to show every noble house from Florence to Naples that their will could crush any lineage, no matter how ancient or powerful. And as Alfonso endured this silent psychological siege, preparations of a very different, sinister kind were unfolding in the depths of the Vatican. Cesare personally took command of the feast on the wedding night, and his vision extended far beyond what even the most decadent circles of Rome would dare to whisper about. Behind closed doors, he met with his father to approve the details of the performance. Details that would horrify any soul that still retained even a shred of reverence for the sanctity of the Church. 50 of the most brilliant and famous courtesans of Rome were secretly selected and brought to hidden chambers beneath the apostolic palace. These were not common women of the street, but educated, refined ladies who frequented the salons of the nobility and whose services were employed by cardinals and ambassadors. Many trembled with fear upon learning what the Pope expected of them, but none dared to defy the head of Christendom, whose power was absolute. They were ordered to dress in lavish velvet and silk garments, which, they were told, they would later be made to remove. They were led through secret corridors by the dim light of lanterns, so that on the wedding night they could be directed into the papal apartments without warning. The servants, who had become unwilling witnesses to these sinister preparations, crossed themselves repeatedly, whispering prayers that clung to their lips like frost on a cold night. They knew that within the walls of the Vatican, in the very heart of the faith, something unholy was beginning to awaken, an ancient, nameless evil. Even Lucrezia, who was deliberately kept in ignorance, felt it. Although she was excluded from most of the preparations, She sensed a dark, oppressive tension thickening in the air, as if before an execution. Her maids reported with fright about unfamiliar faces slipping through the corridors, of courtesans appearing in rooms where they did not belong, and of her brother Cesare moving through the palace with a cold, anticipatory smile that made their blood run cold. On the night before the wedding, unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere of anticipation any longer, Lucrezia fled to the Sistine Chapel, not yet completed, but already magnificent. Beneath the vast, stormy sky painted by Pinturicchio, under the gazes of prophets and sibyls, she collapsed onto the cold marble floor. She prayed not for love or happiness. She had long ceased to hope for that, but for salvation, for divine intervention, for a sign from above, for anything that could stop the impending nightmare. But the chapel remained deathly silent. The divine seemed unimaginably distant. The candles flickered in the winter draught that penetrated through ancient cracks in the walls, as if struggling to stay alive in the face of the encroaching darkness. Outside, the Vatican prepared for a celebration that was meant to erase the line between sacred ritual and unspeakable debauchery. In his chamber, Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies, reviewed the final protocol for the evening. His hand trembled as he dipped his quill into the ink, leaving blots on the parchment. He understood all too well that what he was about to record that night would either be buried forever in the Vatican archives or would one day become the most damning document in the history of the Church. The night of October 30th, 1501 was approaching, and with it, a spectacle that was destined to bring even the sacred walls of the Vatican closer to hell. The dawn of October 30th brought with it all the external grandeur of a papal wedding. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica echoed over the 7 hills of Rome, their tolling mingling with the cries of merchants and the noise of the crowd. Thousands of people filled the streets surrounding the Vatican, eager for even a glimpse of the infamous bride, the Pope's daughter. Inside the apostolic palace, Lucrezia was being prepared by a dozen maids, who moved in tense silence. She was dressed in a gown of shimmering silk, embroidered with gold and pearls, that glowed like liquid flame in the candlelight. Her famous hair, long, blonde, and meticulously braided with jewels woven into it, cascaded over her shoulders in intricate plaits. Her face was as pale as marble, powdered to hide the fatigue and the dark circles of fear beneath her eyes. When she looked into the Venetian mirror, she did not see a bride. She saw a victim being led to the slaughter. The wedding ceremony took place in the papal chapel, a hall awash in gilded walls and holy images, where the air was thick with incense. Alexander VI personally conducted the service, his booming, confident voice filling the sacred space as he joined the hands of Alfonso and Lucrezia before the altar. Long rows of cardinals in their scarlet robes stood motionless along the chapel, their faces carefully carved into masks of piety and humility. But behind their practiced devotion, something else flickered, a poorly concealed fear. Every one of them knew the Borgias' reputation. Every one of them sensed that what they were witnessing today was merely a prelude to something far darker. After the ceremony, the guests, including ambassadors from the major powers of Europe, were escorted to the Borgia apartments. The halls, resplendent with Pinturicchio's frescoes, where stories of saints, heroes, and ancient myths stretched across the walls, were now to be the backdrop for the approaching debauchery. Enormous tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, pheasants still adorned with their bright feathers, mountains of exotic fruits, and goblets of wine from Italy's finest vineyards. The cardinals, Roman nobility, ambassadors from Ferrara, and carefully selected courtiers filled the room, creating the illusion of a brilliant celebration. Alfonso and Lucrezia sat at the head of the table, trapped in a festivity that already felt unreal, like a masquerade concealing something monstrous beneath. At first, the banquet unfolded like any other noble feast. The gentle music of lutes and viols drifted through the air, mingling with the polite hum of voices. Pre-prepared toasts were made, empty compliments exchanged. The usual diplomatic game of smiles and hints played out. But as the night deepened and the wine flowed freely, the atmosphere began to shift. Alexander, already flushed from heavy drinking, grew louder, his laughter coarser, his jokes more obscene. Cesare, until then silent and still as a statue, slowly rose, and with a slight nod of his head, gave a subtle command. The massive oak doors slammed shut with a resounding thud. Swiss guards took their posts at the exits. No one would be leaving this room. What happened next broke the final remaining boundary between decadence and outright debauchery. At a signal from Cesare, the side doors swung open, and 50 courtesans entered the hall, draped in velvet and jewels, yet unable to hide the animal terror in their eyes. A sudden deafening silence fell over the room, thick as the smoke from an extinguished candle. Then, Alexander VI rose from his throne, smiling as if presenting his masterpiece to the public, and announced that the real entertainment was about to begin. At Alexander's command, the courtesans began to shed every layer of silk and velvet, letting the dazzling garments slide onto the marble floor until they stood completely naked before the entire assembly. The hall, built for prayer and receiving ambassadors, now gazed upon a scene as if torn from a blasphemous, feverish dream. Some cardinals turned away, their trembling fingers frantically tracing crosses on their chests beneath their cassocks. A few ambassadors tried to rise and leave, but the guards at the doors stepped forward, their hands on the hilts of their swords, making it unequivocally clear that no one would escape this spectacle. Alfonso could only stare, his face frozen in a mask of disbelief and disgust. Lucrezia sat beside him, petrified, her tears flowing silently, soaking into the expensive silk of her wedding dress. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then followed the Pope's next command, which made even the most cynical courtiers shudder. The naked courtesans were ordered to dance between the long banquet tables, directly before the eyes of the princes of the church. Servants lit tall candelabras, and their flames cast ragged dancing shadows on the frescoed walls. The women moved in the flickering light like ghostly figures, their naked silhouettes writhing over the holy images of martyrs and apostles. Saints and angels watched silently from the ceiling as the Vatican transformed into an arena for a pagan ritual. But Alexander was only just beginning. In an act designed purely to humiliate everyone present, he ordered the servants to bring baskets of chestnuts and scatter them across the polished marble floor. The nuts rolled between the feet of the horrified guests, the sound of their falling echoing like faint, distant thunder. After this, the Pope announced the next phase of his depravity, which would forever be recorded in history as the banquet of chestnuts. The courtesans were to crawl on all fours between the legs of the cardinals and nobles to gather the chestnuts, like animals driven into a grotesque, humiliating contest. The woman who collected the most would be rewarded with silk robes, gold jewelry, and treasures from the personal papal treasury. The humiliation that followed was so extreme that Johann Burchard, hardened by years of observing the Vatican's darkest moments, would later write in his diary that he found it difficult to describe in words without violating the laws of propriety. 50 naked women crawled on the sacred floor of the Vatican, between the scarlet robes of the princes of the church, while Alexander and Cesare watched from a dais, laughing, pointing fingers, and placing bets as if it were a cheap performance in a port tavern, and not an event in the beating heart of Christianity. Some young cardinals, drunk and stunned by the madness of the night, laughed and applauded. Others, the older ones, bowed their heads, crushed by the unbearable war between their faith and their animalistic terror of the Pope. Alfonso sat motionless, unable to comprehend that this nightmare was part of his wedding feast, enacted in the Vatican itself, under the gaze of the man who claimed to speak for God. And Lucrezia, poor Lucrezia, her wedding dress had become a shroud for her soul. Her tears had dried, turning into a frozen expression of absolute emptiness. She had always known her father and brother were capable of monstrous acts, but she had never, not even in her worst nightmares, imagined they would turn her own wedding into a ritual of public damnation. And yet, even now, the night had not reached its darkest, lowest point. As midnight approached and the Vatican clocks struck 12, Alexander finally announced the end of the banquet of the chestnuts. The naked courtesans, exhausted and humiliated, huddled in the corners with their paltry prizes. Wine soaked the tablecloths. The guests sat frozen, half drunk, half stunned, completely morally broken. Alexander, however, was sober, focused, purposeful, and his next command silenced the hall so completely that one could hear the crackling of the dying candles. In a voice steeped in absolute power, he announced that the sacred duty of marriage must now be consummated. But what he commanded next crushed everything that remained of dignity and humanity in that room. He proclaimed that Alfonso d'Este must prove the marriage to Lucrezia not once, but 3 times, and not in the privacy of the marital bedchamber. Every witness present, cardinals, ambassadors, courtiers, was to remain in place to attest that the union was irrevocably sealed before the face of the Church and the world. The hall fell into a horrifying, deathly silence. Even Cesare, whose name was synonymous with cruelty, looked sharply at his father, momentarily taken aback by the sheer, unimaginable audacity of this decree. Alfonso slowly rose, all color drained from his face, leaving only a deathly pallor. He was a prince of a great house, raised on the ideals of honor, dignity, and duty. But now, surrounded by Cesare's armed men, whose hands were already gripping the hilts of their swords, he understood that refusing this command was impossible. It would be tantamount to suicide. He turned to look at Lucrezia. She was trembling all over, like a bird trapped beneath the shadow of a predator. Her eyes were empty, her spirit already broken beyond the point of resistance. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped. Under the murderous glare of the guards and the Pope's expectant, almost sadistic gaze, Alfonso had no choice. He led Lucrezia into the adjoining room, a space normally used for private audiences and receiving diplomats, now hastily converted into a furnished bridal chamber. The doors were left wide open. No privacy, no veil, no humanity. Those who had not fled in the first moments of chaos were forced to stand in the outer room, in full view of what was to transpire. What followed was not a union. It was a public, ritualistic destruction of 2 human beings. The witnesses watched in stunned silence. Some whispered desperate prayers. Others wept quietly into their handkerchiefs. Even the courtesans, themselves just victims of humiliation, turned away in sorrow. And as the night wore on, and the Pope's terrible command was carried out step by step, one unspoken truth filled the Vatican. Something sacred had died in that palace, and Rome would never be the same. By the time the night had passed through its last, darkest hours, Lucrezia had descended into a state beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. Her mind, in a desperate attempt to survive, had detached itself from the nightmare unfolding around her. She moved mechanically, unthinkingly, as if her spirit had fled her body to escape a horror she could no longer fight. And then, just as the first pale, gray light of dawn crept through the high windows of the Borgia apartments, Pope Alexander VI gave the order for the third and final performance of his monstrous decree. Cesare was present again, coldly observing, controlling every detail with the same clinical detachment he applied on the battlefield to ensure his father's will was done to the end. When the ordeal was complete, he triumphantly declared that the marriage was now thrice consummated, sealed in the eyes of both church and law, impossible to contest or annul. Alexander VI raised his wine cup in satisfaction, smiling as if the night had been nothing more than an extravagant celebration, rather than a descent into a moral abyss. What remained in the room were the survivors, a collection of broken souls, forever bound by a shared secret. The cardinals, who had entered the apartments in their scarlet robes as servants of God, now stood as unwilling witnesses to an atrocity they could never confess. Their silence, their inaction, had made them complicit. As the sun rose over Rome, it illuminated a scene of utter devastation. Empty wine jugs, chestnuts trampled into the marble floor, exhausted courtesans curled in corners, and guards standing like statues with their eyes downcast, avoiding looking at anyone. In the adjoining room, Lucrezia lay perfectly still, staring at the painted ceiling as if it were miles away. Her body remained in the room, but her spirit was somewhere else, in a place unreachable, a place of safety. Alfonso sat on the edge of the bed, trembling violently, his face buried in his hands. Nothing in his life, no battlefield, no political threat, had ever broken him as this night had. There was no revenge strong enough to reclaim what had been taken from him, his honor, his dignity, his humanity. Within days, he quietly left Rome, broken beyond repair, returning to Ferrara with a silence he would carry for the rest of his life. Not once, not in any letter, not in any conversation, did he ever speak of that night again. But such a story was impossible to contain within the walls of the Vatican. Rumors of the banquet spread like the plague through the Eternal City. Whispers on the streets of Rome turned into a roar across all of Italy, then exploded into reports sent to courts throughout Europe. Ambassadors wrote coded letters to their rulers. Priests spoke in veiled warnings from their pulpits. Nobles read dispatches in stunned disbelief. The Venetian envoy famously wrote, "What happened in the Vatican surpasses even the darkest fantasies of ancient Rome." He declared that the Pope had disgraced not only his daughter, but the entire Church, turning the Holy See into a den of iniquity. The Borgias had been feared before, but now they were seen as the very embodiment of evil and decay. In marketplaces and taverns, people lowered their voices when speaking their name, as if the family itself could hear their whispers from hundreds of miles away. Across Europe, reformist preachers seized upon the story as irrefutable proof of Rome's moral rot. Among them was a young monk who would soon plunge the Church into the greatest turmoil in its history, Martin Luther. Years later, he would refer to the Borgia feast as a symbol of everything poisoned and putrid in the Vatican. Meanwhile, Johann Burchard, the one man who had seen everything from beginning to end, recorded every detail in his diary. His hands trembled as he wrote, aware that his account could either disappear under the cloak of Vatican secrecy or one day become the most damning testimony ever written about the Church. Lucrezia Borgia never escaped the shadow of that terrible night. She moved to Ferrara with Alfonso and desperately tried to build a new, normal life as Duchess. She funded charities, patronized artists and poets, and cultivated a culture of beauty and piety. But those who saw her in private described the same thing: a lingering sadness, a quiet melancholy, eyes that had seen too much and could never truly laugh again. She bore Alfonso several children, but their marriage, irrevocably poisoned by that night, was an empty shell. They lived side by side, but separated by a wound no person could heal. Lucrezia died young, at 39, from complications giving birth to her 8th child. On her deathbed, she asked for a priest and prayed until her last breath. Her final recorded words were, "I am ready to finally find freedom." A freedom she had been denied her entire short, tragic life. Alexander VI died just 2 years after the banquet, and rumors whispered that poison, the tool he had so often and skillfully used, had finally found its way back to him. Cesare Borgia, stripped of his power and lands after his father's death, fell in a lonely ambush in Spain. His body, riddled with blades, was mutilated and thrown into an unmarked grave, far from the greatness he believed he was born for. But the night of October 30th, 1501, did not die with them. It became a symbol, an icon of corruption so profound that it fueled the flames of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and other reformers would repeatedly cite the Borgias as proof of the Vatican's decadence. The counter-reformation that followed was, in part, a desperate attempt to erase the stain of this family from the Church's history. And yet, the truth survived, buried in archives. Centuries later, Burchard's diary resurfaced, dragging this event back into the ruthless light of history. Even today, more than 500 years after that night, the banquet of chestnuts and Lucrezia's triple humiliation stand as infamous reminders of what happens when absolute power loses all restraint and humanity. It warns us that humanity's darkest deeds are often committed not in dark alleys, but in places that should be sacred. The story of Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night is not just a story. It is a mirror, a warning, a reminder that evil often thrives in silence and tacit consent. The past is not dead. It watches. It warns.